yeah, a few people are missing, so it would be just useful, I think, for them to have this. But great. So yeah, as I've explained to the group, you know, we're sort of going to do this as a kind of Q&A. So also, and this is to all of you, if you want to ask Tom anything, I think the best way to go about it is just to write your question in the chat, because then we can kind of come to it at an appropriate moment. And so do feel free to ask anything, really. I think it's fair enough to say, but as I say, to kind of keep it in so in a kind of a way so it works in a fluid way. I think, yeah, rather than sort of asking a question aloud, if you have a question for Tom, can you just write it in the chat, and then we have a sequence and we can take it from there. So Tom, yeah, maybe to start with, you could just tell me a bit about your kind of your own experience as a writer. I mean, perhaps introduce yourself a bit as a writer.
Yeah, sure. I suppose it was a bit of kind of unorthodox route, really, but then generally writers you don't seem to get a kind of you know, there are no two sort of journeys are the same, I've found, when you talk to writers, and that's probably a good thing, because it means that you are able to have some unusual experiences, which then hopefully kind of inspire you to write something different and unique. But yeah, I mean, for me, it was I probably, like a lot of you guys, if not all of you, I always wanted to be a writer, and it was I suppose it came quite easily to me as a kid, whereas other disciplines certainly didn't. I remained pretty much innumerate, unable to add up, and know very little about anything else, very little about science. But I was the sort of arts and humanities, you know, anything that involved kind of yeah, sort of reading and writing, really. I just took to quite a young age, and so when I left university, I didn't sort of particularly want to join a newspaper or work for a publisher or have a sort of career path like that. I just became a kind of freelancer, really, and I just did any kind of writing that I could to sort of pay the bills. And I've also really always been interested in traveling, and I know, you know, Tom, you certainly are, and we have a sort of shared love of travel writing. So in my mid-20s, I did some sort of quite a lot of traveling in Asia, and fell in love with certain parts of it, particular areas of it, India and the Philippines, particularly. And the Philippines became really my main focus. So for about the last 10 years, I've been writing in various kinds of genres, I suppose. I'm not a big one for, I think, yeah, the sort of differences between forms and genres in writing, I think, are overstated and not that important to me anyway. So for that, but then that has meant that I've been a bit of a jack of all trades. You know, so I've done academic writing, I've done travel writing, and I continue to do those sorts of things, bits of satire, quite a lot of journalism, quite a lot of sort of political commentary, foreign affairs type. Well, I was doing more reporting, but since COVID, I've moved to sort of, yeah, commentary in newspapers and magazines, mostly magazines, really, actually, here in the UK, about Philippine affairs. I've been getting quite interested in going to the National Archives here in sort of London area-ish, Q sort of area, and getting hold of declassified documents, British government documents that reveal more about or reveal new things, new and unpublished aspects of British foreign policy towards the Philippines, particularly during the Marcos era, which I don't know how much people would know about that, but it was a sort of particularly appalling autocratic and brutal period from the sort of mid-60s through to the mid-80s. And so yeah, I'm sort of comfortable being in archives and trying to track down, yeah, as I say, kind of strange documents that haven't been looked at for 30 years, as I am going out into the world and walking around and doing that kind of field work that is more associated with the travel writer or the reporter. So I think, you know, if you're interested in doing both of those sorts of types of research, then I think that does give you some extra strings to your bow as a writer.
Mm-hmm. I mean, just yeah, I mean, I haven't really talked about research or that side of it, but I mean, sort of how much does it actually sort of entail? You know, I'm sure it varies from sort of text to text, but just as a, you know, a kind of process.
Yeah, well, I mean, there was a good quote that I came across from the late Christopher Hitchens, you know, who's a sort of probably one of the most important sort of British journalists of his generation, who said, when someone asked him, how do you start writing a book? What's the kicking off point of that? And he said, I start by reading everyone else's first, you know. And I think that's not a bad way to go. I mean, if you've got the time, I mean, very often, you know, time is the difficult factor, is the really, you know, I mean, I suppose I'm lucky since I got into an academic. I've been teaching now at Portsmouth University for 10 years, and there's a certain amount, I'd like there to be more, but there is a certain amount of support for research and sort of expensive things like traveling. So that's been very useful. And also, you know, you're able to sort of, as it were, sort of buy your freedom from time to time to just read as much as you can and just try and get a sense of what everyone else's perspective has been, so that you can then start to find maybe some gaps or some niches that you can fill. And that's certainly the case with all the work I've done about the Philippines, really. There are things you discover on the ground by talking to people and, you know, going to those places that maybe other people wouldn't think to go of, or maybe a bit too scared to go to. But then there are other things that you discover sort of secondhand by reading other people's stuff and, you know, looking at documents. And I mean, that's not always, I mean, for my last book, it was a sort of an academic survey really of about 200 years of Western writing about the Philippines. There's some very good books, you know, very good accounts, but there's quite a lot of rubbish, to be perfectly honest. But because I'm making an argument, I'm mounting a critique, actually struggling through some really badly written and very problematic sort of colonial adventure novel from 1899 has its reward, because you know, it's something to aim at, you know, it's a sort of, you know. And I think whatever you do as a writer, even if it seems boring and painful at the time, it will make sense in the end. I think V.S. Naipaul said, writers like problems, writers need problems. And whether that's problems of, you know, research, or problems, even sort of problems in one's personal life, you know, or, you know, things that happen to us that are usually seen to be unpleasant. I don't know, relationship breakups or people dying or tragedies of that kind. If you're a writer, you can, I don't know, it sounds a bit kind of wrong to say, or a bit distasteful to say that it's all material, but it kind of is in a way, you know, I mean, it's helpful to, you know, every story needs a conflict and a sort of problem to be dealt with, I think. You know, whatever story we're talking about, whether it's a screenplay or a novel or a piece of narrative nonfiction, a piece of travel writing, there's some sort of challenge to be overcome, I think. You know, at least that's the way I try and see it. So, yeah, if you've got those sorts of challenges or difficulties from real life that you can sort of draw into your, supposing, you know, you are a nonfiction writer, then yeah, not only hopefully does it make for a better story, but it also may have some sort of therapeutic benefit. I mean, I think there's a lot of evidence increasingly that kind of writing about your, you know, innermost feelings, even if those feelings are sort of negative or, yeah, difficult experiences that you've had, is actually very sort of good for the mind and the soul, dare I say.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, that's true, isn't it? And maybe that's where a lot of us start from, in a way.
Yeah.
You know, I think sort of writing about things that I want to understand something about it, why has this happened, or what's it, mean, and so on. Certainly in sort of poetry type stuff. But I mean, interesting. Also, I was interested in what you mentioned there about, saying about non-fiction and story, and one of the, as you know, I've written travel writing too, and one of the sort of, well, problems, I guess, again, like Paul was talking about, is reality doesn't necessarily make a great story. So it's kind of, would you say that's one of the sort of challenges of writing creative nonfiction, is kind of finding how to do that, how to structure it?
Very much so, Tom. I think that is absolutely key. And I think, speaking now as a teacher like yourself of creative writing, that's something that I find a challenge to teach how to overcome that challenge, if you understand. But it's an energizing and an exciting one, because everybody has their own sort of approach, I suppose. I mean, I've tried to learn from other writers. So I mean, there was a debate very pertinent to this back in the pages of one of the literary magazines in the you may remember it. You'll certainly be aware of the main, because we've had lots of good conversations about these sorts of figures in the past, between these two sort of titans of travel writing, Paul Theroux and Bruce Chatwin, in the pages of the London Review of Books or something like that back in the 80s. And it was this sort of, I think, fairly polite argument. And on the one hand, you had Paul Theroux saying the challenge of, turning real life into narratives is that you've got to stick to what really happened. And no matter how boring it might have been. And he spent a lot of time on trains, and I love train travel. It's my favorite form of travel, but it can be extremely boring. And so he was like, well, I've gone all around the world on trains, and it's, you find a way of making the mundane and the banal even somehow, or you edit it out, or you just deal with it, but you don't make things up. And then Bruce Chatwin, in his sort of more iconoclastic sort of rebel style, came back and said, oh no, I mean, just when I submit a novel when I submit a book to my publisher, I think I'm submitting them a novel, but they say, no, this is travel writing, because it's a sort of marketing. And at that point in the 80s, travel writing was the golden ghetto, wasn't it? It was very easy to, very difficult to sell travel books now, but it was a different time and a different sort of period. So yeah, I think looking at what other writers have said about this and the way that they've tried to tackle it. I mean, I think I've attempted, I'm not a purist about this. I've attempted both approaches, really. I think I've written bits and pieces of, I suppose, fiction or faction, where I've really taken liberty with what really happened, whatever that means anyway, because we can then argue about, everybody has their own perspective on reality, and it's a social construct anyway. And but I think someone, Colin Thubron, another of that generation of sort of great British travel writers, who I'd actually interviewed last year. I'm very lucky through a sort of family connection, not of my family, a friend of mine's family, who's sort of very much sort of embedded in sort of British publishing world, back in the day. He didn't say this to me at the time, but elsewhere I've read a comment of his where he talks about you can play around with time, and chronology. So as we know, a kind of story arc goes like that. It's that shape because the story is supposed to get more and more interesting until it reaches a kind of climactic moment. I'm sorry if this sounds a bit 101. I'm sure, Tom, being the accomplished you are, you've dealt with this, but I'm just restating this to get
no, please,
hopefully a slightly more sophisticated point. But and obviously Thubron pointed out that so if you spent 20 days driving around the Soviet Union in a clapped out old Trabant or something, which he did, I think he spent longer than that actually, maybe the most interesting thing that happened to you happened within 5 minutes of arriving, but you don't put that like 10 pages into the book, because from then on it's just going to be, it's going to be a kind of ski slope shape rather than an arc or something, right? So he said that you could, I think this is absolutely valid, you know, you can kind of move that when you come to write up that experience in the chronology of your story. You can move that event to somewhere near the end, you know, and so you've got, so it feels like, so it's a more story-like structure. I think basically there's no rule of thumb about this. I mean, there's a sort of commercial or a professional aspect to this. I mean, if you were to, it depends who you're writing for. If you were to hand in a very colourful, creative, sort of camp Chatwin-esque narrative to a magazine that had commissioned you to write something to effectively guide people about the realities of what it is like to travel to wherever it may be, Eastern Europe or Australia or Iran or whatever, you would be in trouble, I think. So there's something to do with maybe the pact with the reader. If you come out straight away and say, look, as Chatwin did, look, as far as I'm concerned, this is just fiction, or it's my imaginative interpretation of what happened to me, then you're on safe ground. Where writers seem to get into trouble is where they have fictionalized, but they try and pass it off as having really happened. And there was a case of a guy called James Fry in the United States some years ago, who wrote this very sort of severe, sort of misery memoir type book about struggling with drug addiction and all sorts of other tragedies. And he was on the Oprah Winfrey show, and the book became a bestseller. But then it turned out that you know, he'd really just kind of gilded the lily, or worse than that, you know, he'd really fictionalized a lot of what happened. And he got in trouble, and it all became a bit of a sort of ritualistic sort of takedown of him in public. You know, this being before social media. If it happened in the sort of social media, it probably would have been even worse for him. But so yeah, you get in trouble if you're not kind of honest and straight up in the first place about sort of how much you fictionalize. That seems to be, yeah, the way it works. But
yeah, I agree. I mean, this is something that yeah, I mean, I've kind of thought about in a couple of ways. And one was, you know, yeah, my travel writing was mostly about going around on trains, to go back to that that point. And yeah, I found that, yeah, there's only so many times you can kind of describe, you know, getting on a train or, you know, so I think my solution there was editing. It's like, okay, I'll describe it once and then we can take it as read, you know. So just to mention that, but also that that thing about perspective is a very interesting point too. And I did an experiment with my family, because there's a, you know, quite a famous incident I've talked about endlessly about being held at gunpoint in Albania.
it's a great story, yeah. And a great
actually, I think it was for one of our son's school projects, but we each wrote our version of that event. So to fill in, guy, I haven't told you this story yet, but basically the first time we arrived in Albania, within 10 minutes, I went into a bank to get some money, and I came out and my wife and kids were being held at gunpoint by 3 strange men with Kalashnikovs, and I didn't know what to do. Fortunately, it all ended happily. But so each of us all wrote, and it was amazing, the difference. You know, like the vehicle that was involved. You know, I think Sarah, my wife, and Sam both said it was a van. Lydia and I both said it was a Mercedes car, you know, and kind of stuff like that, and how long it went on for and everything. And that was really eye-opening in terms of that. So again, that was another thing. Yes, but I thought of that because your thing about bigging up the fictionalization, if you have. And I think one of the things the solution I found was just, I have to sort of emphasize that this is just my, you know, interpretation of the subjectivity element as well, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I think you can, there's another good book called The Art of Memoir by Mary Carr, which goes into this really intriguingly. And it's about sort of like, what are the limit, at what point can you, there's a piece of writing about nominally the real world or real experience. How far can you sort of take that before you stop calling it non-fiction and it becomes fiction? And does that matter anyway, you know? Mm-hmm. And she sort of says, well, you know, the human, you know, we tend, sort of memoir and autobiography and those sorts of genres that you and I are so fond of and work in, are obviously very subjective. That everything's being filtered through, the mind and the body and the feelings of an individual person. So there's already that sort of limitation. But the mind is, when you experience the world and trying to transcribe it into writing, it's not just, it's not like a camera that's just recording what's happening there in real time. There's also, that information goes into the brain and it triggers memories and it triggers allusions and it triggers things that we might have learned secondhand, things we might have read about. And I find that kind of interesting, what is the kind of point of view of the traveler writer, or the memoirist, and I think what I like about travel writing is that there are things that that the writer must have experienced themselves, no matter how sort of fictionalized or altered it might have been. But then there are also things that they couldn't have possibly, there'll be a segue back into the history of that place, which they must have learned. And you might say, well, that's not very naturalistic, at all. That's not realistic in the way that ordinary people walk around the place and absorb information. But then so what? That's one of the, that's why people read travel writing, because they want that kind of they want those different perspectives or those different points of view within one book or one narrative, if you see what I'm.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking then of you made me think of the Rings of Saturn. Yeah, Sebalt's book, and
absolutely
how that. I mean, that's interesting on all these levels, isn't it? Because I think it's now being kind of classified as fiction.
Yes.
I mean, because there's no evidence that he actually did the walk along the Suffolk coast, which he said he was the occasion for this great reflection.
That's ironic, because that would have been, given that he lived in Norwich, that would have been an easier thing to do rather than all the the sort of very sort of dark kind of callbacks to the Holocaust and German history. And you think, well, look, mate, come on, at least just walk up the road, kind of thing. But
exactly. And how but as you say, it's got all that vast amount of stuff which is obviously true in history, or real history at least. And
I think he can also I think, and what he does and what I've tried to do is to reconstruct, like there's a couple of chapters in my Realm of the Punisher, which is my sort of travelogue of the Philippines, where I go to I start off with something I couldn't have experienced myself, and definitely didn't experience myself, which is a sort of scene from the Battle of Manila, when the Japanese were driven out finally by the Allies at the end of World War II, and it was just an absolute, and by the end of it, Manila looked like Hiroshima or Nagasaki, but they'd only used conventional weapons. That was how intense the kind of that last, there was no nuclear weapons involved, absolutely leveled the place. And so there's a scene from that which I put into italics so that I didn't, lest the less kind of attentive reader thought that I'd invented a time machine and gone back to, 1945 or something. And then what I tried to do there was to transition from that into me standing there in 2016 or whatever it was, in the place where that had happened, which is now a golf course. There's actually quite beautiful, one of the few beautiful green parts of Metro Manila. And then commenting on how the only Japanese presence now is sort of like businessmen who come for a cheap weekend to play golf and, drink cheap beer and, no doubt sort of find a young lady and have a good time and then go back to their sort of zaibatsus or whatever back in Tokyo. And so that, I think, that was, me trying to experiment a little bit, but it was honest to my own mental workings, because here I was reading so much about that period in history, that this was a if you like, an accurate and realistic reflection of the sort of the state of my head at that time. It
Yeah.
was what I was seeing in the sort of phenomenal world around me. Of course, that was this rather boring golf course, but I was trying to superimpose what I'd spent that morning reading about. I think it sort of ended. I wanted to go into the golf course, and there was a sort of an armed guard standing there. Everyone in the Philippines seems to be armed, outside a shop, and I don't know, whatever, it's sort of like that's your kind of your responsibility. If you own a shop, you can't necessarily depend on the police to protect you. So there's a lot of gun ownership around. It's a little bit disconcerting for, if you come from a country where you don't, where guns are pretty much banned, which they are in the UK, fortunately, I suppose. And I think I said, is there any chance of me going in to just look around the golf course, And he said something like, what's your business? And I said, no, he said, first of all, no, you're prohibited. The public is prohibited. And then I said something like, but I'm a journalist. And he said, in that case, you are extra prohibited. From then on, I learned that it's not actually a good thing. Like journalists, especially in that country, maybe others, probably in Britain as well, they don't have a very good reputation. They're seen as kind of troublemakers and out to just stir the pot. From then on, I described myself as an academic or a professor, and then doors seemed to open. I don't know, something about the snobbery of, that people kind of have about these things. Writer, I'm not sure if I just said writer, he probably would have thought I was out to make trouble as well. But anyway, there's a sort of tip for you anyway, if you go to, ever go to the Philippines and wonder how you might access certain places, don't say you're a journalist.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's that's true. I used to do that. Yeah, I used to say I'm a journalist, and it yeah, it depends, but even in Britain, and you would get that kind of slightly alarmed reaction. Well, what are you doing here? And, well, I just really just want to walk around this building or this place because it's interesting, and
there's still a notion of a journalist in the UK as being a kind of, people think of a tabloid hack, sort of drinking whiskey from the morning and the crumpled trilby, and kind of will sell their own grandmothers for a story or whatever. That unfortunately is not an image that's helped by a lot of journalists themselves. But anyway,
that's another story. Yeah. No, so that's, yeah, I mean, and I suppose the other one thing one of the things with travel writing I'm also quite interested in, which you kind of alluded to there, is also this idea of time. Actually, I'm sort of being specific about when you're experiencing something. I think that's another aspect of this sort of almost like protecting yourself from accusations of whatever bias or whatever. Because sometimes I think there are texts which sort of don't do that, and they kind of, the writers seem to be under the illusion of they're describing exactly how another place is and how it's always been and how it will always be, and it will sort of never change. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do. Which in itself is sort of problematic, isn't it, in the sense of being perhaps, I mean, you find that kind of trope very much in a lot of colonial era writing about the Philippines, and certainly about the Middle East. If you read people like Edward Said, you'll and the sort of Egyptologists and the colonial sort of travelers that he critiques in his Orientalism sort of studies and things. Yeah, this idea that something timeless and things will never change about Arabia, or where anywhere east of Dorking, quite often, isn't it? So actually, yeah. So there's a sort of a moral and a political problem with that. But yeah, like you say, it is a problem of technique, and yeah, that's a good point. Actually, I mean, that's probably something that's probably worth kind of investigating more, because I think you probably find it in. I think I've tended to find that problem when that a writer has spent a long time travel, like a year or 2 years traveling in a particular place. And then they produce like 200 pages based on that. And you think that maybe things would have become out of date or things would have changed. I mean, I suppose you're always at the mercy of that, aren't you? I mean, my publisher for Realm of the Punisher was very keen to, you know, have Duterte somewhere in the title, who's just stepped down, thankfully, although unfortunately we've got someone who might be just as bad with words, Ferdinand Marcos Jr. But yeah, I was worried about it sort of, yeah, having a sell-by date with, you know, because I felt like I didn't, this wasn't just, there's so much more to the Philippines than one cranky autocrat, you know, and, you know, as important as it is to try to tell that story, I just felt like I wouldn't want people to feel in a few years' time, you know, oh, well, what's the point in reading that? That's not very contemporary because it's, you know, about this guy who left a few years ago, you know. But you know, I think the publisher just made a calculation based on trying to maximize sales of a book that isn't exactly going to scream bestseller in this part of the world anyway, you know.
Yeah.
So I don't blame them for that, but you know.
Yeah, I suppose I mentioned it because, you know, when I was writing up the stuff from, you know, our travels in Southeast Europe in that was 2006, 2007, and again 2010, I think it was, you know, it was just so obvious that, I mean, particularly in some countries, particularly Albania, things were so different when we went back. And I remember when I was writing up my PhD, I just had to keep adding chapters because it was, you know, because just in a few years, you know, it changed very remarkably. And that whole sort of idea of change is something I'm kind of quite interested in, I think.
Yeah. And do you think now, 10, 12 years on, the changes there have been more changes presumably, and therefore you'd, then I suppose I suppose it's sort of, it's back to kind of how you sort of frame it and how subjective it is, and whether I think with travel writing, it's on a spectrum, isn't it, between kind of how much of it is about the traveler writer and their experiences. I mean, I think some travel books, it's almost, you know, the setting or the place is secondary to, you know, someone's kind of journey within or something, if that doesn't sound too cliched. And then on the other side of that spectrum, you know, you never really get a sense, you know. I think someone like William Dalrymple, great as he is, I think there's like one mention of his wife who he never names in one of his books, and beyond that you don't know anything about the guy, because it's about India, and it's about, you know, trying to understand this and, you know, particular culture that he's kind of embedded himself in. And I mean, I guess there's sort of how you pitch it somewhere on that spectrum, really, you know.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's very true. I mean, there was a kind of, I don't know whether you call it a phase, but, you know, sort of 1970s travel writing. There's quite a lot of that sort of I'm off to find myself stuff. Yeah. And you know, I think there's that Peter Masterson book, The Snow Leopard,
right,
so with the sort of quintessential hippie journey to the Himalayas. And, you know, although it's ostensibly about looking for this snow leopard, this very rare animal,
right,
it's, you know, that makes a kind of fleeting appearance on page 250, and that's it, you know. So yeah, and as you say, other ones like William Dalrymple are virtually invisible.
Yeah.
But I suppose that's kind of about, like you say, it's a spectrum, and it's up to like where your sort of narrative voice is.
I wonder if there's also difference here in terms of like the gender of the writer as well, because I'm thinking, I'm just aware that I've only talked about posh white male writers so far, and it's really important to say that there's obviously a fine and very long tradition of female travel writing, which predates the novel, certainly, and probably almost any other literary form that's around today, you know, I mean, apart from poetry, I suppose. But you know, and I think you tend to get, there's more of a willingness to kind of, yeah, someone like Dervla Murphy, I think, is really interesting, because she's someone who's incredibly well versed and knowledgeable about, you know, international relations and other cultures, and she does all that kind of work and more to understand, you know, I mean, she wrote a brilliant book about Cuba and also about being in Gaza during one of the many Israeli incursions there, and so she really understands, you know, it stands up as a fine piece, I mean, to the point where you know, academics have lauded it as being, you know, very, very good scholarship. But then she'll talk about, I think, is it the Cuba book, I think, where she travels with two generations, I think her daughter and her granddaughter, which again is just fascinating in all sorts of ways, because it then, you know, to go back to what you're saying about perspective, and, you know, there is her perspective, but then her granddaughter is going to feel very differently about where they are. And so that whole kind of relationship between, you know, the self and the place, or the individual and the place, is made more complex and interesting, because you, I mean, in fact, like Tom, you know, like your, you know, the fact that you went with your family and they all had different perspectives, and that absolutely added you know, an extra layer of intrigue to the story that you were telling, in a way that the very, very often, you know, that's runs very counter to that sort of tradition of British male travel writing, you know, where it is all about the individual, you know, and there's a sort of slightly macho aspect to that as well, you know, the individual who goes out and tries to, you know, survive on his own. And you know, there's a certain tradition of that in Philippine people like James Fenton, James Hamilton Patterson, who sort of go out and they're very much isolated, or they're very much on their own. They're not terribly interested in, you know, anything other than I don't know, probably being a bit unfair actually. But, I mean, for example, what I mean about that sort of isolation is that one of Hamilton Patterson's books, called Playing with Water, is about him living on his own on an island in the Philippines, and learning to be a subsistence fisherman, basically, you know.
Right.
And while he's there, he's able to reflect. It becomes autobiographical, and he reflects on his life back in the UK and growing up, and his relationship with his father. So there's that, but like I say, it's quite different to, yeah, there's not really the sorts of exploration of what it's like to have company, or to have different perspectives running alongside yours in a travel narrative, I guess. So,
yeah, I think that's also, yeah, it's kind of, that's also, perhaps that's true of quite a lot of creative nonfiction generally.
yeah,
You know, or can be. It's a sort of trap, I think, isn't it? Where I'm thinking of ones where sort of more historically oriented books sometimes, and you know, you sort of think, okay, yeah, this guy spent, you know, he's interviewed lots of people, and we get loads of sort of verbatim material and whatever, but actually the narrative of the book is really the story of how this guy, typically a guy, you know, has kind of done all this great hard work, and you know,
yeah,
it took me 8 years to find this bloke who told me, you know, that kind of angle, I think, can sometimes be a bit of a danger. Sort of like a, you know, I was talking to Peter Robinson the other day actually about this, and it's sort of a bit performative.
definitely.
You know, it's like a sort of show.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's the same with foreign correspondents and foreign affairs reporters, which, you know, I suppose have a kind of familial connection to travel writers, you know. And there's definitely a kind of culture amongst them, which is about trying to kind of expose yourself to the most violence and suffering as a almost in a competitive way with other journalists. And reading a really good book about this at the moment by a guy called Mark Podelti, who's an academic ethnographer who went and just spent a long time talking to American journalists during the El Salvador conflict, in the sort of late 80s, early 90s, I think it was. And he observed the sort of, let's say the performative kind of behavior of these people. And it was a very sort of, to use a kind of contemporary term, very sort of unsafe space for the few women journalists that were there. They were completely shut out of this sort of rituals of heavy drinking and storytelling and one-upmanship about, well, I saw 15 people get bombed the other day. Oh, I saw 20. So there, kind of thing. So yeah, I think there's, that's a, sort of an unfortunate, I suppose that comes down to wider social problems that we probably don't have time to get into here. But yeah, I mean, obviously writers don't exist in a sort of vacuum away from, much as they often would like to think they do.
But do you think, I mean, to the sort of more, do you think that things like travel writing and so on are opening up a lot more to sort of what you might call new voices, which seems a bit stupid because there have been voices around for ages, but it's just no one's listened to them. But
definitely, I mean, there's some really, I really think so. I mean, one of my, he's not that new, but one of my favorite travel narratives of all time, which came out in the sort of mid-80s, I think, but I think probably paved the way for, like say, new voices, was The European Tribe by Tom Phillips. Who is, I think, probably possibly better known for drama and sort of other forms, but has written, not just that travelogue, but other very impressive travelogues. And what he does is he takes a lot of the assumptions, I suppose, we've been talking about, the sort of white male masculinist sort of colonial or neo-colonial sort of attitudes to the rest of the world, and inverts them and travels around Europe. This Carol Phillips, I think, is an guy of African Caribbean origin, and grew up, I think, in the north of England somewhere in the 50s and 60s, and unfortunately was, as was the norm and is still to a certain extent obviously an issue, was subjected to a lot of discrimination and racism, and but so he comes from that subject position and decides to talk about Europe. He travels to France and Germany and and looks at Europe from this sort of outsiders, this non-European sort of perspective, and it's very funny and very ironic, because he's sort of turning, he sort of makes these points when he looks around one of the museums commemorating the Holocaust, saying, hang on, for decades I've had people telling me, and people like me, that we come from these savage parts of the world, Africa and the non-Western world. As far as I'm aware, there's never been anything as bad as what happened in Europe in the in the 40s, and 2 world wars and God knows how many genocides, and and so it's a really interesting sort of turning round there. One of the funniest chapters is when he goes to Gibraltar, and is amazed, even that's the book came out in the mid to late 80s, but he goes to Gibraltar and finds it almost like this kind of weird simulation of like the 1950s in England, with people hanging on to some idea of of cream teas and watching the horse racing and warm beer, and at a time when Britain itself was becoming more multicultural and diverse. Here's this sort of last outpost, and he was almost certainly the only sort of non-white person or person of color to be there at that time, and just finds it very very amusing, but probably a bit disturbing as well.
Yeah, I can imagine that. Yeah. Well, that's a kind of I've encountered English communities here in Bulgaria which are a bit like that. They're more English than the English. It can be. Well, it's kind of funny and a bit kitsch, but there is something disturbing about it as well. That sort of, why are they choosing to replicate this kind of slight, rather old-fashioned way of life? I don't know.
But then that's exactly sort of question that the writer, the travel writer, should ask, and that's exactly what Phillips tries to sort of get to the bottom of. And even if you don't find a definitive answer, the attempt to answer it makes for a good story, I think, at the end of the day.
Yeah.
But no, you're absolutely right. And I think it's usually communities that in reality have quite a tenuous link to a coherent idea of a national identity or a community. I don't know how many, I was just thinking of, just very anecdotally, a friend of mine who is very kind of, he supports Scotland in the football, has Scotland flags in his house, and loves Scottish stuff. He's not Scottish. His dad was Scottish. He lived there for a few years when he was a kid and has hardly been back, but will get very touchy if you point this out to him, I mean, in a similar sort of way, I've always been obsessed with the 1970s culturally, in terms of the literature that came out. I only, sadly, and I regret this, I only was alive for about 2 months of the 1970s, So sometimes we're kind of wistful for something that we never really, or nostalgic for something that we never really experienced, it's quite, I don't know. Anyway, sorry.
No, that's interesting. Well, yeah, I mean, I'm a wee bit older than you, so I did actually experience the 1970s.
I'm sure it wasn't all that great.
Well, it's kind of interesting because I was born in 1964, so by the time, everyone kept talking about the 1960s in the 1970s and how great the 1960s were. And I think it kind of rankled a bit. Yeah. So now I'm a bit like you. I'm kind of, but my perspective, and I want to write something about this, so it is relevant to the writing thing, because I'm still trying to find out a way of doing it. But I quite like to write about the 1970s and all, because I do still feel it's slightly misrepresented, perhaps in some way, culturally as much as anything. Like a lot of the literature from the 70s is not kind of quite hard to think of the sort of key.
Well, I'm a bit of a mad new wave of science fiction fan, so I think people like J.G. Ballard, I'd say probably had some of their finest moments in the. Some people might argue the 60s, but I suppose the beginning of sort of postmodernist literature in the US, sort of John Barth and people like that. Would that be the 70s, 60s? Don't know. But music, in Britain, I think I'm a huge fan of the music of that period, particularly sort of punk and new wave.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that's the kind of thing I'm. Yeah. That I was 12 when kind of happened.
I'm so jealous. Genuinely.
So that's kind of all there. So I know. I mean, this does relate to what we were talking about at the beginning, and kind of the beginning about sort of real life being, a nuisance because it doesn't fall into a story. And I'm kind of, I suppose, in the position now, trying to find a way of writing about that that's neither just a kind of nostalgia fest. Sure. But also,
I think you'd be very well placed to do it. I mean, with all your interests and being someone who has written about culture and music for a long time, but also someone who could craft that into a kind of memoir type narrative would be great. I often think that's the book that everyone should write at some point, like something quite autobiographical. I've often said this to sort of other people, friends of mine, and saying, well, maybe your story, is, early years or, formative years or something. However, not necessarily as a straight ahead autobiography, but, or memoir, but, fictionalized or, and I think maybe have to get to a certain age before you do that. I'm starting to try to shoehorn a bit more of my upbringing on Hayling Island, which is a seaside town, because I'm doing a travelogue about seaside towns in England now.
Yeah.
And and I feel like I've got a lot to get off my chest about growing up on Hayling, you know, it being quite a strange, quite boring place by the time I had come of age there, but had been quite an attractive place to go. And, you know, later in life, I've met people who have said, I used to go on holiday with my family to Hayling Island, and I would say, now pull the other leg, you must be joking. Why would anyone do that? I spent 16 years or 18 years trying to get out of there. But then you get older and you mellow out, and I go back now and I go walking around there and I go cycling around there. It's actually, I appreciate the other things. It's a, you know, natural environments and things that as a 16 or 17-year-old I wasn't interested in at all. I was just pissed off because there wasn't anything to do. You know, there were no pubs or, you know, anything to really, for a young person to do. No music, no venues, you know. Yeah. So anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I'll ask you a bit more about the seaside towns in a minute, but it was interesting what you're saying about the autobiographical thing, and I think it's kind of quite, it's interesting, isn't it, how quite a lot of writers do, well, they either start off with that, you know, so I'm thinking like Jeanette Winterson, and Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, you know, it's kind of, yeah, autobiographical, pretty conventional in some ways, subject matter, maybe not at the start. I mean, then she kind of goes all postmodernist and so on.
Yeah.
Well, and Dickens, isn't it? I mean, he's sort of David Copperfield, pretty much. That's quite an early one. Yeah. So on, and all people come back to it as well, I think, sometimes in their careers. So I think it's sort of something around in quite a lot of writers' minds, maybe. Sort of, oh, I've still got this one story I haven't told, you know. And
is it maybe waiting for the right time to tell it as well? Because without getting morbid at sort of 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning, I think some writers, I think I've kind of heard them say that, you know, they wanted to write about their parents or their fathers or something, and be really honest about it, and perhaps quite that could result in offending them. I remember, I think when Salman Rushdie published Midnight's Children, even though it was a novel, the father character of the protagonist was so closely modeled on his father that I think his father in real life didn't talk to him for 10 years, you know. So you might have to wait till people are dead, basically, to, you know, before in some
I mean, that is a thing, you know. That's a whole other area, isn't it? Sort of writing about other people, who actually exist, and maybe that is it, you know, because I found this really weird thing out about my father. Well, it's just weird. In the village where I grew up, right, so before I was born, my parents' closest friends were an American couple, and I never knew, and they moved back to the States before I was born, but I never knew why they were living in this small village in Buckinghamshire. You know, what were they doing there? It seemed to be a really weird thing. And then when we went to visit them, they lived in Washington, DC. And it didn't even occur to me at the time, but I was about 14, I think. And he took us into like the Capitol, the Pentagon, you know, like places where tourists weren't supposed to go, you know, and he didn't seem to show any ID to anyone or anything. And, you know, now thinking, I think that's really odd, you know, that's a bit weird. And then about a year ago, I was, I don't know, just tootling around on the internet. And I discovered that Cheddington, which is the village where I grew up in Buckinghamshire, was actually a secret CIA base.
No way. Wow.
I know, extraordinary. and you know, from about 1945 until about 1980. So while I was still living there, and you know, and there was a disused airfield, and apparently it was sort of hidden in the sort of slightly crumbling aircraft hangars and stuff. No. And so I can only imagine that this American guy, friend of my father's, was a CIA agent. Must have been.
Yeah.
You know, that's why he was doing that. And then, of course, my father worked for British Airways, or BOAC as it was then. And he went to Moscow all the time. So I'm thinking, and
Wow.
then you have to add in that my godfather also worked for the Secret Service in Britain. So
Right.
I'm kind of thinking, was my dad like a courier or something? So
I mean, just to investigate that would
yeah,
be extraordinary, for your own kind of interest, but also, yeah, again, it's another story, isn't it?
yeah,
Potentially,
yeah,
absolutely extraordinary story that.
yeah. And I never suspect, so I suppose that's part of our kind of job, isn't it? Sort of finding
Yeah.
stories like that, or even just a hint of one. And
of course, neither of them could ever have really talked about it if that was the case.
No.
So, it was no surprise that you weren't aware of that growing up.
Yeah. I would. Anyway, tell us a bit about the Seaside Town project. That sounds very
Yeah, well, for me, it's a departure because it's working with an artist, an illustrator,
yeah.
colleague and friend of mine, and we just, I'm sort of in. I don't know the first thing about art. I can't draw. I'm a big fan of comics. I've always been a big fan of comics, and which are now slightly pompously called graphic novels, aren't they? But I just prefer the word comics, and I think some of the great contemporary writers. I mean, I think someone like Alan Moore is a really important contemporary writer, but he just happens to have has written quite good novels, but his sort of chosen form has been comics. And so I've always had this ambition to write a script for a comic book, and I've sort of had a go at treatments, and I've tried to pitch stuff and not really got anywhere. And then I thought, well, there's Louis's thing is reportage illustration. Like, he goes out into the world and he observes people and he sketches, and there's obviously a crossover with the kind of what I do with words, or try to do with words, and yourself too, and a lot of people, reporters, travel writers, whatever you want to call us, reportage people, whatever. And I just like the idea of, it was during lockdown and we were having some meetings on Zoom, as you had, was the only way to do it, wasn't it? And there was actually initially a group of about 5 of us, colleagues at Portsmouth, who were all a friend of mine who's interested in branding and design and is fascinated by the kind of fonts and sort of lettering that you find in seaside towns, and another colleague who's more interested in the kind of historic, the sort of social history of seaside towns. And then by the time we'd had a few of these meetings and lockdown had eased and you could actually at least travel to certain parts of England, if nowhere else, it came down to me and Louis, who were just available, and we started going to, we've been to Torquay in the southwest. I suppose we might have to explain some of these places, because most English people don't have a clue where they are, let alone based outside. So I hope none of this is, it's going to sound like kind of nonsense, but these seaside towns with a variety of attractions and things of interest. We were, you get, there's lots of different sort of problems that seaside towns are facing that are very contemporary. Where I live in Southsea, which is a sort of seaside, used to be a kind of seaside resort part of Portsmouth, there's huge sea defences being erected, because we are in serious danger of being underwater in 40 years' time. Because of climate change, rising sea levels. So Britain, being an island nation, a small island nation, not a big one like Australia, where people can keep retreating into the interior, presumably while the water laps over. We're seaside towns that seem to be at the kind of the front line of some resistance or war, almost, to this real problem, this huge, the climate emergency, as it's rightly been called. So there's and that's very evident, and I think it has a kind of psychological impact on people. There's a sort of a fear and a sort of anxiety about that may be unconscious amongst people in seaside towns now. There's often an air of sort of anxiety, aside from that you kind of observe going to these places, and that's often to do with the fact that health outcomes in a lot of seaside towns tend to be a lot worse than in what we call inland England, you know. And there's been a recent government report on that, showing that, you know, people tend to die younger, health provision is poorer, things like that. So there's a lot of poverty, there's a lot of people recovering from addiction issues are sent out to seaside towns. I mean, probably for good reason, because of the idea of it being a reasonably nice environment and the sea air being a kind of healing thing. So there are the kind of challenges like that, but then we're also fascinated by the kind of, you know, the weird and unique sorts of amusements, you know, things that you only get in English seaside towns, like certain types of arcade games and certain types of foods, you know, certain types of you know, sweets and candies that only seem to, and sometimes these things seem to be kind of weirdly metaphorical of the sort of some like kind of broader situation or problem that, you know, a seaside town is in. I mean, I've always been obsessed since being a kid with those. And again, this might be that there must be equivalents abroad of this, but forgive me if this sounds very kind of Anglo-centric, but you know, those sort of arcade game machines where you have these moving metal cliffs almost.
Oh God, yeah.
Coins that topple over.
Yeah.
And it to me, there's something about geographically, you know, that there's the like representation of, you know, what a lot of seaside towns are, which they're on cliff edges, they're next to the sea. So it kind of seems appropriate that you have a game that has cliffs. There's that notion of there being no skill whatsoever. You just put your coins in the machine and wait until some topple over, and I think that appeals to, that says something about the slight desperation that, well, I felt this growing up in a seaside town of like, maybe I'll luck out and I'll just win a game of total chance like the lottery or whatever, or I'll, you know, marry the right person, and I'll get out of here with, you know. And so it's a sort of scaled down version of that, where you put enough 2p's in and yay, you hear all the coins tumble out, and you've made it, you know, you've made enough money to buy a hot dog or something that day, you know. So yeah, there's things like this, sort of, I'd say, sort of weird and strange kind of stuff like that, but then, like I say, some kind of more sobering problems that are kind of facing a lot of seaside towns these days.
Yeah, no, I think that's it. Yeah, I think that's very true. And you know, that's interesting hearing about the sort of things you pick up from actually having, you know, from going to these places. And then and I think that's that sort of confirms two things I always think about. One is that, you know, noticing stuff like those coin games, you know, and sort of looking at them in a different way and sort of seeing them as from a, you know, almost metaphorically, as you say. And also finding that, in fact, because I know what you're saying, these towns are often written off as being just nowhere now, because their great days as being a seaside resort are over.
Absolutely.
You know, they're a bit right. I'm thinking, you know, near Bristol, there's Severn Beach. We're almost legendary in its dullness, you know. And one of the most entertaining pieces of travel writing I ever did was I wrote a piece for Venue magazine by getting on. There's a train that still runs out to Severn Beach from Temple Mead, and I did that as a day trip, again with the family.
Right.
And you know, people say, well, what are you going to write about? There's nothing there. And well, there wasn't really. I mean, people still live there, but the pubs shut, virtually all the shops were shut. There was one cafe, I think. But that was great. That's all, that was the story. So, I mean, that kind of idea of as travel writers or reportage writers, as you say, is kind of that. I'm a great believer you can kind of pretty much find a story anywhere.
Definitely.
And that's kind of like that's kind of one of the skills, I suppose.
Well, I mean, the other thing is that yeah, there are places that are dull. I mean, there are places that that we've been to where they're actually just quite nice and quite well appointed. And so somewhere like Bournemouth, we spent some time there, and I actually went back there for a little holiday with my partner later on in the summer, because it was the nearest we could get to going to a, it was warm, and there's a nice beach and you can swim there. We couldn't go abroad for that, but it was difficult to write about Bournemouth because, that's a compliment to Bournemouth, because it's really tastefully done, and really lovely places to eat out, and a very diverse sort of population, and things are, I mean, it helps having the very wealthy people paying their taxes locally and stuff, and lots of trees. I live in Portsmouth, which is seriously lacking in trees compared to other British cities, but Bournemouth is very, very beautiful in that way. So it was easier to write. It was actually easier to write about Jaywick, which is almost like the opposite of Bournemouth. I mean, I've not seen poverty. This is a coastal town in Essex, or not far from London, near Clacton-on-Sea, and it is just shocking and shameful that there are people living in what are sort of shacks, basically. Like Louis and I have both traveled a lot in the global south, Africa and Asia, and I've not seen anything in the Western world, to be honest with you. I mean, there are parts of the US, I think, that I've not been to that are probably that poverty stricken, but yeah, many of these homes had no electricity, had generators in their gardens. They looked like they'd been constructed from kind of, I don't know, stolen or sort of salvaged materials. It was like a slum that would be normal to find in Manila or Bombay or somewhere like that. But here, this was a couple of hours from London, one of the richest cities in the world. So that was easier, because there's just more immediate drama and kind of conflict there, and just visually, I think for Louis, it was much more interesting and much more unusual, and just to describe what we saw in fairly straightforward terms, and without too many adjectives, without too many adverbs, and the sort of classic style which we all, show don't tell, kind of all those sorts of cliches, was I think kind of was almost all we had to do, really. It didn't take much editorializing or too much kind of interpretation, really. It just was its own sort of, like you were saying earlier, Tom, about sort of real life not organizing itself into a story. Well, somewhere like that does very easily, but again, from the perspective of, I suppose, relatively privileged, university academics who nonetheless have, seen worse and, equivalent stuff in other parts of the world. But yeah, I suppose for the audience, we published a couple of articles off the back of that, and it will form part of the book. And yeah, the reaction that we got was, similar kind of shock and concern, really, that people were condemned to sort of live like this, really.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's that kind of contrast.
Yeah,
in sort of the way places operate or whatever is also kind of an interesting.
Well, you say it's interesting. Contrast, I think, is a really important word here, because you'd see all these say very simple dwellings, but then you'd see kind of a lot of American flags, and these kind of American flags with commentary that seemed to relate to 9/11. Our America has been attacked, but we will fight back, and that's a real kind of anomaly, like almost something like out of surrealism. I was thinking, like, what on earth do these people what on earth do people in this part of Essex care about a sort of a terrorist attack from 20 years ago? Whether they had just found this salvaged this piece of material and stuck it on because they like the look of it. I don't know, but it seemed, yeah, there were, and Louis being American from New York, was even more amazed to see, yeah, sort of the Star Spangled Banner on people's windows, and we never quite got to the bottom of that. It wasn't really, I think we were both a bit too timid to go and knock on the door and say, "Excuse me, do you mind telling why you've got that American flag on your..."
Yeah, I couldn't help noticing, but
yeah.
Yeah. Well, I suppose again, that's the thing, isn't it? I mean, sort of picks up a bit of what I've been saying in this class. But, you know, it's about those kind of details of the things, aren't they? You know, that's kind of finding those. That's the kind of gold dust.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. So, well, thanks, Tom. It's kind of I don't know if any students have any questions or anything.
I do, but should I write it?
No, you can. Well, no, you're here now. It's fine.
Actually, how can one become a music journalist or a film journalist?
Tom, you're probably much better placed to answer that question than me, because you've actually done that sort of stuff. So I don't know.
Well, I think
not really done that myself. So
yeah, I can especially broaden it out a bit. I mean, it's about. I mean, I became a music journalist by sheer chance, typically. Well, no, a cockiness actually. I just reviewed an album and sent a review to Tribune newspaper in London, because that's where George Orwell had written. You know, I'm about 21, 22 at the age. And unfortunately, the then music culture editor, Paul Anderson, wrote back to me and said, "Yeah, great. Do you want to do a monthly column?" So, I mean, that's how that happened. And then I was working in local radio, and they asked me to go and watch a play. So then and review that, and then I kind of ended up being a theatre reviewer. So I don't, you know, even though I've done it, I can't sort of explain what the, you know, I think the thing is you sort of have to do it, try it.
One thing that I would just add as a non-expert, absolutely not. I mean, what I have done, I think also the same as you, Tom, is I've written quite a lot of book reviews and what you might call literary journalism. Yeah. And I think that if we can broaden this out to, sort of journalism about culture, you know, film, whether it's film, music, you know, arts and culture. I mean, I think it goes back to what you said, Tom, about detail being crucial. And I think as I understand it, with music, I'm a sort of fan of music journalism, but don't think I've ever, and I'm a fan of music, obviously, but I don't think I've ever written. I might have done a couple of reviews for my student paper or something of that, but what I always thought was the challenge of music journalism was sort of, as it were, translating one language into another, like the language of music, and how you talk about music, you know, in terms of, you know, melodies, certain types of rhythms, you know, beats, chords, guitar sounds, production, that kind of stuff. How you represent that accurately in the English language, right? Or the, you know, the sort of, how you, without kind of lapsing into kind of cliches. And I think I remember, I don't know where I heard this comment from, but some music journalist or critic of some kind saying there's a lot of that sort of lazy music journalism where people will just say, this new band, it sounds like a cross between Tom Waits and, you know, The Clash or something, you know. Actually, that would be quite good. I'd probably
sounds okay.
Yeah, it sounds right. But, you know, and so, and there you go, you know, it's a sort of vague, sort of lazy way of trying to describe music. Whereas what you would want ideally from a reviewer would be, well, okay, can you quote some lyrics? What are the lyrics like? What does the singer sound like? You know, not just a person, but can you, you know, use clear language? You know, is it a kind of a rasp? Maybe there are some adjectives here that, you know, rasping or high pitched or low pitched, you know, try to make me hear in my mind's ear what this music is like through your writing. You know, it seems to me, right? You know, in the sense that, you know, maybe with travel writing, you've had an experience of a place, and you're, you know, and it's a sensory experience, and you've got to find the right words to try to sort of almost implant that mental picture or mental experience into the brain of the reader. And if you're very vague and abstract and you're not really interested in details, you just say, well, there was this beach over there, rather than maybe describing the, you know, the colors and sizes and textures of the stones, and, you know, what kind of rubbish. There was a load of rubbish on the beach, but let's zoom in and what kind of, are we talking about? Black plastic bags full of, I don't know, bandages or dog poo or whatever. It's that, yeah, it's, I think detail is just key really with any thing, and you have to get, I think it helps probably to know about music and to learn a little bit about, you know, what, you know, perhaps, you know, as I say, music is a language in and of itself, isn't it? And you can learn about sort of tone and scale and, you know, the different words for you know, types of singers. Baritone always seems to be baritone, doesn't it? Sort of like Jim Morrison and, you know, the classic rock singers, baritone. Or
Baritones.
if you're a heavy metal singer, then it's very whatever, falsetto or something.
Tenor.
Tenor, yeah.
Usually with new metal, I'm interested in that sort of genre. I like this band Korn, if you've heard it. It's American.
Yeah, 90s classic. Yeah, 90s.
I really like them.
Yeah, I liked them back in the day. Yeah.
Yeah, you're right. I think that's true. It's kind of a poet whose book I reviewed recently said something really nice actually about my review, and that was like, he just said it's really nice not to. He said you haven't reviewed it, you've read it.
That
Which I thought,
yeah.
So it was like, I think it was because I am quite aware when I'm writing reviews that also what you said, I hadn't really thought of it this way, but I think that's what I do try and do, is try to, you know, kind of, this is the experience.
Yes.
I'm not trying to I'm not trying to sort of slot a band or a play or a poetry book into a kind of ready-made hierarchy. You know, I'm just going to try and describe what the experience, what was the experience, you know.
Yeah. That is, I think that is really good point, and I may steal it if ever I have to.
Well, you gave it to me, Tom. I'm stealing it from you.
Well, the experience. I think that, but it comes. You've put it much more succinctly than me, and I think, yeah. What was it? Especially live music. What was it like to be there? Because there's a whole other set of criteria that you've got to bring. It's not just the sound of the music, is it? It's the kind of the atmosphere of the venue, and how many people were there, and what did it smell like, and, you know, was the sound any good, you know? I think maybe I'm just being nostalgic and being a bit of a grumpy old man, but it seems to me that I was talking to a colleague about this the other day, and there seemed to be the quality of music journalism, I think, has kind of gone downhill. I mean, I picked up a copy of the NME, New Musical Express in Britain, which was the real benchmark. Great writing in there.
Yeah.
A few years ago, I think it might not even be a paper anymore.
No, I don't think it is online. Yeah.
And I picked it up at a gig, I think, and read through it, and I just thought, God, this is just cliche-ridden rubbish. It really is, you know. And you compare that to, you know, a book like England's Dreaming by John Savage, which I read at school, and that turned me on to write one of the books that really, I mean, I didn't become a music journalist, but the like extraordinary kind of depth and range, and it was about punk rock and likening it or relating it to other things going on in art and literature, you know, the way that people like J.G. Ballard's kind of dystopian cityscapes found their way into the lyrics of The Clash. If you listen to a song like London Calling, it's absolutely Ballardian, you know. You know, an extraordinary piece of work. You know, Lester Bangs was another great to me. And I could be wrong, but you don't seem to have those great music journalists anymore, but I don't want to, just at least not that I'm aware of. But
the Rolling Stone is a good one.
Who's that, sorry?
The Rolling Stone is a good example. I think they write also about politics
Hmm.
and reviews of albums and interviews.
Yeah. Yes, Rolling Stone has always been a quality paper. Matt Taibbi, who used to be their political editor, he stepped down a couple of years ago, is one of my favorite journalists, but he's not really a music guy. But if the music guys writing for them are half as good as him, then I imagine that it's still pretty good. So yeah, I was probably too pessimistic about it all.
Yeah.
I've written some things in the chat when you talk during your conversation, if you'd like to read it, but
yeah, sure. So you so you talk about Tokyo Vice, where a journalist explores the criminal underbelly, especially the Yakuza. This is a journalist or some non-fiction, or is it
it's fiction, but it's about it was based on a book. I don't know what's the name of the book, but it's about a journalist who goes to Japan to live there and learns Japanese and works undercover and explores the Yakuza world.
Yeah, I think I've heard of the book. Yeah. Is it an American journalist who moved to Japan?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. I've not read it. I should. It sounds up my street. Would you recommend it? Have you?
No, I've just heard about it. I've seen the trailer of the series.
Yeah. Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, no, I'm always open to recommendations. You mentioned the story of the male individual can be seen in Man and Butterfly, Robinson Crusoe, Gulliver's Travels. Absolutely. I mean, does it? I suppose that coincides with the, a lot of sort of travel writing, English travel writing of the classic kind, Sentimental Journey, Stern, and people like that. I'm guessing it's of its time, isn't it? The rise of kind of bourgeois individualist society in the 18th century, the Enlightenment. It was all about the guy on his own going out and, taking, his sort of commanding view over, the sort of non-European world. So yeah, no, I'm sure you find that in those sorts of ideas in literature, fiction and art and drama and things. Yeah.
Yeah, and Butterfly is American. It's by David Huang, and he is Chinese American, and he wrote about China. And do you know the story?
Sorry, did David Cronenberg make a film of it, didn't he? Is that
Yes.
right? You see, sorry, I thought that was Madame Bovary.
No.
Just sorry, I read it and my brain just didn't compute it. So I was thinking that was more of the era of, that's closer to, well, not quite the same time as Gulliver's Travels, but yeah, go on. Yeah, sorry. So it's a more recent one. Is when Madame Butterfly.
It was from, I think it's from the 90s. It's about.
Oh, okay, that recent. Okay, yeah.
It's about this French diplomat who goes to China and falls in love with a Chinese opera actress, but he didn't do his homework and didn't know that those are actually men.
Oh, okay, right.
And they have a relationship, and it explores the themes between men and the theme about men and women, West and East. And he's very commanding to, like, Gallimard. And they talk about how America is male because of its big guns or corporations, and the East is female because of its delicateness and affinity for art.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, I suppose a bit of a rejoinder to some of those sorts of colonial narratives, then maybe it sounds like. Yeah.
Yeah. With each read, there's a new theme that comes up.
Zara, I think the other comments are from you. So do you want to mention them? I feel like I'm sort of speaking for you at the moment.
Well, about the savagery of colonial and imperialist countries, that can be seen in Heart of Darkness.
Yeah.
Yeah, because Joseph Conrad is of Polish descent, and he has a question whether who is more savage, the tribes or the English that take over Africa.
Yeah, but it's a complex one with Conrad, isn't it? Because there's the sort of, I think the critics, I think Chinua Achebe, the Nigerian writer, despite that kind of, that undoubted skepticism about the, colonial project, Achebe came to the conclusion that Conrad himself was, quite problematic in his views about race, and I think elsewhere he was sort of, was quite interested in, sort of authoritarianism, and people described him as sort of proto-fascist. But I think other critics have been more sympathetic. So yeah, I suppose it's just a debate that goes on. But no doubt he does exposit in the merry dance of trade and death, or something, is how he describes the colonialism, which is quite telling.
So actually, about the English communities in Bulgaria and elsewhere, they take this tactic home away from home. There was in the Passage to India film, they built homes which were very English, and they make parties, and they take English culture and incorporate it into Indian, and it turns out that it took over the Indian culture.
Yeah, I mean, the experience I was talking about is very much not like that. It's out in the countryside in a small village, and yeah, they just basically reconstructed an English pub in their house. And they have games nights and quiz nights and serve warm beer and all the things that So there is probably a home away from home thing.
It's an English village in Bulgaria?
No, it's a Bulgaria. I mean, there's a village with quite a large number of English people living in it. And I went and stayed there just to see so it's kind of interesting seeing people and the way people replicate home.
What is it called?
Oh, I knew you were going to ask me that. It's near Varna, and it's I can always get it wrong. I should know it's where my landlady lives, but I'll find out. I'll tell you.
Okay.
I'll tell you another time. Okay. Well, I think we better. And on nostalgia, actually, I should also say that this is the big theme of a Bulgarian novel that's just been published in English, Tom.
Right.
Yeah, in fact, this week.
Excellent.
Georgi Gospodinov's Time Shelter is now available in English. And he has this great thing that, like, all the countries of Europe have a referendum to decide which decade they're going to live in.
That's amazing. That is such a great premise. Time Shelter.
Yeah. And it's kind of, I think Brexit probably sort of sparked the idea. But yeah, it's very good.
So Britain already made that sort of decision, and it was probably the sort of 1850s or something as well.
Yeah.
I don't want to say what they decided,
Yeah, exactly.
That sounds right up my street. Thank you.
Yeah, I think you'd like that.
Also, about nostalgia, it's Midnight in Paris by Woody Allen.
Yeah.
And have you seen it?
Yeah, I have. Yeah, it's very good. Yeah,
I love it. Yeah, the nostalgia for the 20s, and then at the end for the Belle Epoque.
Yeah, and it's a good comment on that, isn't it? About some of the problems with nostalgia, and how, by definition, it's kind of probably going to disappoint people if they cling to it too closely. Which is true enough, I suppose.
True, isn't it? Right, Tom, thank you very much indeed for that.
Thank you, Tom, and thanks for having me, everybody. I hope that was at least halfway interesting. It was. I really enjoyed it. So
yeah. I mean, I did. It's just great to be able to, hear. I think also someone else's perspective. You're also a writer. You're also a teacher. So it's, we kind of hopefully that was useful for the students. So great. Okay, and thanks everyone for listening, and I will see all you guys next week.
Do we have homework?
No, well, not necessarily. You can.
That's I like your style.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of writing exercises will be in the notes when I'm on Moodle, so you could do those if you like.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, I'll do
Yeah,
that.
we'll leave it like that. Okay, brilliant. All right, thanks everyone. I shall.
Thanks everyone. Take
Thank
care.
you.
Yeah.
Take care. Bye bye.
Cheers. Bye bye.